Let's look at the second sample script for Task D. So this response starts off with the email address, and it refers to an attachment, ticket revenue reconciliation concerns, and the concerns are presented in a table format. So when we look at the coverage of the number of reconciling items, there are only 4 reconciling items being addressed. So in terms of coverage, only 4 of the 7 reconciling items have been addressed, and the response is silent on the rest of the reconciling items. So let's look at each of these reconciling items with the explanation of the concerns being raised. So the first aspect being raised is flight ticket cancellations could be accounted for twice in the reconciliation. So let's read the explanation. In getting to the theoretical revenue amount, cancellations were taken into account. It is concerning that in reconciling this to the TB, further cancellations are deducted. Were these not included in the ticket cancellations of 50 million rand? So this response is recognizing that in the pre-release information, the CFO already attempted to reconcile the passer system to the TB. So there was an initial reconciliation being performed. And then on the day, a follow-up reconciliation has been performed, or a more detailed reconciliation has been prepared. So what this response is probing and identifying as a concern, whether there's not double counting. So in the pre-release information, there's already been an amount that has been included or accounted for in the initial reconciliation that refers to flight cancellations, and that has already been deducted. So on the reconciliation presented on the day, again, there is a deduction for flight cancellations. However, this does not really speak to the concerns around the specific reconciling items. There are actually a number of issues with regards to the flight ticket cancellations options given to the travel agency RSA Travel. And what you'll find here in the comment box are just to name but a few of those valid issues or valid concerns. First, what could have been or what should have been probed and identified as a valid concern, asking why the cancellations take place outside of the passes system. That's the first possible concern. And why is a written document sent to on time? A second issue is the lack of review of credit notes. Why is the credit notes not authorized? Or raising the concerns around granting this agreement to RSA Travel, whereas RSA Travel is a related party to on time through the directors that's related. And none of these concerns have been identified for the first reconciling item. So no valid concerns identified. Let's move on to the second reconciling items. It refers to free tickets issued to customers. Those free tickets are being added to the theoretical revenue amount. Are these tickets for flights already taken place? So one needs to be careful when you present or ask a question that you need to supplement this with a further explanation or further probing to clarify what the concern is. Now, this response does explain further, so it continues. If not, it makes no logical sense to add them to the theoretical revenue amount, as they do not present revenue, but rather an expense. So this does not clearly identify what the real issue is. So the real issue is that it's not revenue to start off with, because there's not an amount. It's free tickets. There's no revenue being generated. No revenue is being received. So one cannot put a value on the revenue. So that is really the issue. So the issue is not whether the flights have taken place or not. So there's no valid concern being raised for the second reconciling item. Sales of non-refundable tickets. The fact that Jim authorized sales and insisted on what can be recognized as revenue is indicative of a weak control environment. Now, this is a bit vague, so it does not as yet clarify or properly explain what the concern is. So for the first sentence, nothing yet for which we can give credit for a valid concern. But let's continue. Firstly, the policy is to sell tickets that are refundable, and Jim has been able to override this. It raises concerns or questions as to the controls surrounding sales authorization. So one needs to be careful with regards to this. So remember that sales cannot be recognized to start off with, because these tickets can only be used in the next financial year from Jan to June 2024. So regardless of whether a senior person authorized this sales transaction, it cannot be recognized in the current financial year. So the issue is not really the authorization, there's a bigger issue. And the response does continue and elaborate further. Secondly, his need, that is Jim's need to meet sales targets, may be viewed as an incentive to be involved in fraudulent financial reporting practices. So there it speaks about the governance concerns or the possibility of fraud, seeing that Jim prematurely recognizes revenue to meet his sales target. So that's the first valid concern being identified in this script. Then directors' personal flight tickets. It is a concern that the CEO's personal assistant has the privilege to capture flight bookings. So when we only look at the first part of that sentence, one needs to be careful and one needs to try and think about this in real life. So in real life, the CEO himself will most probably not be booking the ticket. So most likely, the PA will be responsible to book flight tickets. So the issue presented on the day is the fact that these tickets are issued at a nil value. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that it seems as if more tickets have been issued than what is supposed to be issued in terms of the company policy. So those are the issues that need to come through. So let's continue. So it raises a concern with regards to the PA booking flights. This allows for direct influence by the CEO and opens an opportunity for collusion, which may result in financial losses for the company. So this is a bit of a broad and vague statement. So what is this possible collusion? What creates this opportunity for collusion? And what could possibly result in financial losses for the company? So if we just think about the rand amount we are looking at. So we are looking at a nominal value of 250 rand per ticket for 30 tickets for the year. So that in itself is not really a large amount. So it will not really result in big financial losses to the company. And unfortunately, this response does not clearly articulate what this opportunity for collusion is. So just because the CEO's PA book flights, that in itself is not a reason to state that there's an opportunity for collusion. So what this part of the response should have alluded to or should have included in the response is referring to the whole issue about the nil rand value or the issue that there's more tickets being issued as what is allowed in terms of the company policy. And unfortunately, none of these are coming through. So when we look at coverage, only 4 of the 7 reconciling items have been addressed. And only 1 valid concern has been identified. So the response continues on the next page. I've noted a few additional concerns that relate to essential controls that have not been mentioned. So before we read further, what you need to remember is that you had to look at the reconciliation and identify concerns with regards to the content of the recon. So any issues being identified, any concerns being raised should sufficiently refer back to the content of the recon. So it should not be generic statements. Okay, so let's continue. Number one, the PASS system does not include an accounting package. Therefore, transferring data from PASS to the accounting records has not been documented or acknowledged. Appropriate input, processing, and output controls must involve program controls to ensure that the completeness and accuracy of data being transferred from the PASS to the accounting records. I would just like to note that this may result in fewer differences from the PASS and the trial balance. So unfortunately, this is a little bit generic. It does not tie back to the actual content of the recon. So a bit of a generic statement, not really assisting how to resolve the current issues in the reconciliation. It is true that an accounting package that is actually linked to the PASS system might reduce errors, but the issue is that these additional or essential additional controls being mentioned is generic in nature and does not tie back to the actual content of the recon. Number two, no evidence of regular reconciliations was identified. These must be performed within the PASS system and accounting system, and the potential data transfer from PASS to the accounting system. Recons will assist in identifying errors, potential fraud, or incomplete information. It is also crucial that all differences are solved and the recons reviewed by senior accounting personnel. While it is true that reconciliation should be performed regularly and reconciliation should be reviewed, it's still a generic comment and it doesn't tie back to the actual recon. Number three, controls over security protection measures such as firewalls and review of access logs are essential to ensure no unauthorized access is gained, especially due to the confidential passenger information stored and the provisions of the POPI Act in respect of a breach. So when you read number three, one gets the sense that some of this information is not applicable or relevant for this task. So it almost leans towards information gathered as part of the preparation period, because the pre-release information did speak to the possible need for the financial analyst to look into the systems of internal control. So when you read number three, you get the sense that these measures have been researched and stumbled across in the pre-release period and somewhat now presented as part of this response in an attempt to come up with some valid concerns. However, once again, one cannot tie it back to the actual content of the recon, and on face value, it almost seems like some pre-prepared response coming through and some concerns or even some recommendations coming through, which is a bit generic in nature and does not speak to the information presented on the day. And then number four, no mention has been made concerning VAT on revenue. Therefore, in the absence of evidence to the contrary, we should investigate to ensure VAT is appropriately accounted for separately from the revenue in the PASS system. Once again, a little bit generic in nature. So when one takes a step back in terms of this response, there's not good coverage in terms of the number of reconciling items. Only 4 of the 7 have been addressed. The rest of the reconciling items, the response is silent about it. Nothing is being raised. Secondly, only 1 valid reconciling item has been identified. In addition to that, the second page of the response seems a bit generic in nature, general statements, not tying it back to the information presented on the day. It might, on face value, as I've mentioned, it might on face value appear to be a bit of pre-prepared answer coming through, information that was gathered and accumulated as part of the pre-release period or the research period, which does not really add value to resolve the actual 7 reconciling items. So it's very generic in nature and does not really add value. So when one take one step back and considering all of this, this would be a limited competent response.